The Watcher in the Shadows. Maya had always loved the house on the hill. Its Victorian charm, towering spires, and sprawling garden were like something out of a fairy tale. So, when the opportunity arose to rent it for cheap, she jumped at the chance, brushing off the warnings from locals about the house's dark history. It started subtly, the creaking floorboards at night, the faint sound of whispers that seemed to come from the walls, and the chill that clung to certain rooms, no matter how many fires she lit. Maya chalked it up to an old house's quirks and carried on, determined not to let her imagination run wild. But then, the shadows began to move. At first, it was peripheral, a flicker of darkness out of the corner of her eye. She'd turn, expecting to find nothing, but her heart would thud painfully in her chest. One night, as she was reading in bed, a shadow darted across the wall opposite her. She froze, staring at the spot where it vanished. Her lamp cast no shadows there. By the time she mustered the courage to look over her shoulder, the room was empty. The following nights grew worse. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke her name softly, Myrish, Adari for is firstans anime, Idi Fidenistami. Louder, as if demanding her attention. Her sleep was broken by a tapping at her bedroom door, though no one ever stood outside when she opened it. Desperate for answers, Maya turned to the house's history. She learned of a family who had lived there decades ago. A father, mother, and 2 children. The father, driven mad by isolation and grief, had murdered his family before hanging himself in the very room Maya now slept in. Locals swore the house was cursed, a place where restless spirits lingered. That night, the whispers turned into screams. The shadows grew darker, denser, creeping closer to her as she sat paralyzed in bed. Her lamp flickered and the air grew thick with the smell of decay. She reached for her phone to call for help, but it was gone. When she turned back, a figure stood at the foot of her bed. It was a man, his face twisted in agony, his eyes hollow pits that seemed to drink in the light. His head hung at an unnatural angle, the skin of his neck bruised and torn. He raised a hand, his finger pointing directly at her. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. Maya screamed and bolted from the house, running down the hill until she reached the nearest neighbor's home. She never returned to the house on the hill, leaving her belongings behind without a second thought. Months later, a new tenant moved in, dismissing Maya's warnings as nonsense. The house stood as it always had, its shadows watching, waiting patiently for their next guest.